Good. Well, it is 10 o'clock and we like to be prompt, so we will make a start and I'll just admit people as they arrive. But welcome everyone to this Church Urban Fund session, an introduction to social enterprise. So if we haven't met before, my name is Amy and we're really happy to have you with us this morning. And we are very lucky this morning to be joined by some very experienced people in the social enterprise sphere, both through research and from practical experience. So we've got Dr. Val Barron and Reverend Canon Nick Ralph, and they're going to be, excuse me, they're going to be leading us through quite a lot over the next hour. We're covering theological grounding of the social enterprise model, some inspiring examples of social enterprise in action, all the way to how you can think about getting started in your own church context or faith-related context. So before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping for us. This session is being recorded, but don't worry, your faces won't be visible on the recording. And we'll send that recording around to you afterwards, and we'll pop it on our website as well, so you can direct people there who can't come to this meeting this morning. Also, you should be able to see a Q&A button somewhere on your screen where you can post questions as we go along. For me, it's at the bottom, but if you're on a different device like a phone or a tablet, it might be up the top somewhere. If you can't find it, don't worry. You can always pop a question in the chat as well, or even unmute yourself when we get to the question points. We'll have a couple of points today where you can ask those questions, and I'll pick up those questions that are coming through on the chat. So yeah, thank you again for joining us. We hope this is going to be a really useful overview for you and really get you thinking about the how and why of social enterprise. And I'll start by handing over to Nick. Thank you so much, Nick.
Hi, I'm just going to share my screen so you can see the presentation. Amy has already introduced us. Thank you, Amy. And I think probably easiest if we introduce ourselves a bit about who we are and our backgrounds. Val, would you like to go first?
Hi, everybody. Lovely to see you. Yeah, my name's Dr. Val Barron. I'm a community development worker in Durham Diocese. And I have been working for about 10 years now. I got into post. I was one of the CUF development workers in the Northeast. And I got into post just as Bishop Paul arrived in our diocese and wanted us all to tackle poverty. And I've been exploring different ways of doing that ever since, and ended up doing some research around social enterprise with the William Temple Foundation. I look forward to sharing that with you. Nick?
Oh, yes. I as you can see, work across two dioceses, Portsmouth and Winchester. I run two separate charities, which I've been working in a particularly socially enterprising way in Winchester and trying to in Portsmouth for a number of years. And I'll talk a bit about the sorts of things I've been doing a bit later on as some of the practical examples. But I've been doing this for about 20 years here, and made some mistakes along the way. That's really important to learn. The most important thing you can do is to learn from your mistakes, not to avoid making them always, I would say. If we can get this to move on. Yep. This is roughly the agenda. We're going to get through this in hopefully about 30 or 40 minutes and leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So in particular, detailed questions, but we'll answer them along the way if we can as well. So for a lot of people, you get to hear the term social enterprise, but you don't necessarily know much about it or what it actually is or means. So we'll try and unpack that as we go through. We're used to working in our churches in a particular way on altruism and giving and the charitable sorts of principles. But actually, even churches have to make things pay through giving and manage their finances carefully. And actually, in some ways, the church for years has worked in socially enterprising ways in universities, hospitals, schools. And when you think about it, the monasteries themselves were actually the economic beating hearts of their communities, providing a whole range of support, not just charitably, but also economically. we've actually got an amazing history of doing some of this stuff, but we don't always reach for that or think of that. We tend to think more often in the usual sort of charitable approaches, and often with the sort of grant mentality, which is often an important part of what we're doing, but not necessarily the only one. There are other ways to conceive things or mix things together as well. So a social enterprise formally is a business that trades for a social or environmental purpose. The key word there is trading. So it's actually selling stuff, services, widgets, food, it could be anything, but it's not about generating income through grants or donations. It might be an element of the work, but actually the bit that makes it an enterprise is that trading element. And it's set up primarily for the social good that it's making. So it's not about making a profit, but profits help us to sustain, but it's actually about the mission that underlies the work. And by being a social enterprise, profits are not distributed to shareholders, they're reinvested in that mission. So they're recycled into the work rather than dispersed and lost to the organization. And there are some models of social enterprise, community interest companies that actually are allowed to distribute a portion of their profits, but that's probably in the detail. Mostly they put all their profits back into the social mission. And we often talk about in social enterprise the triple bottom line: people, planet, profit, or prosperity. It's got, what we're doing might be good for the people we employ, or it might be the people who are benefiting at the end of what we're doing. But either way, there is a benefit for the people with whom we're dealing, preferably both in that. We want to work in environmentally sensitive ways and supportive ways, actually, not just to be responsible, but to make a difference. Quite a lot of social enterprises are green social enterprises. And you know, where we can make that work better and economically by generating an income, that's even better. And then profit helps us to keep going. It might be a not-for-profit, but actually you still need to make some small surplus in order to keep going. So that helps us to manage to maintain and gives us a bit of headroom for crises or when a piece of kit fails or whatever. But the point is to increase prosperity for everyone and not hoard it for the shareholders. So the triple bottom line, people, planet, profit, is a really important concept in social enterprise. And the sector as a whole in the UK is huge. Actually, hundreds of thousands of social enterprise now, billions to the economy, millions of people involved. But about half of those social enterprises are under 5 years old. They're really young. They're still in the process of trying to scale up. And some may get support in the initial years from grants or having raised money, and are still trying to get to a sufficiently large scale that they are going to be able to carry on and maintain their work. And so that doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't necessarily happen immediately. It depends on the particular approach and model and how much it's being supported by others or by your own income or family from other areas. But it takes time to get into a sustainable position. And because it's about helping everyone and it's good for people, planet, and profit, it's a much more attractive proposition for employees and for people buying the product, because they know that this is doing good for everyone and going back into supporting more people. So it's good for employment and it's good for sales in its own way. So I'm going to hand over now to Val to talk a bit about her research, because she's actually studied this stuff.
Thanks, Nick. So my research, I bumped into social enterprise. And it was a term I've heard a number of people say, and didn't set out to set up a social enterprise. My bumping in happened with the board of trustees at Communities Together Durham. And there were two people on that board, Kate Welsh, who was a Christian social entrepreneur, and Jim Robertson, who was a Christian community development worker. And every board meeting, they would have a bit of a row about the model we should use. And I found this tension really interesting. And so I started to go along to some of the social enterprise network gatherings, and it was sort of like this parallel universe of people that wanted to change the world. But there weren't many people that I recognized there. So I started to wonder, why is that? Where are the Christians that are doing all of this community social action? Why are we not in this space? Certainly here in the Northeast. And then the William Temple Foundation had some funding, and they've supported me to do a PhD around Christian social enterprise. Can you just click on a couple of bits, because it's not a whole slide. So yeah, that's how I ended up. This was the first interview that I did, and it just sums up, I think, where I found myself. So the church is very quick to pull charity as a tool out of its toolbox, but we hardly ever pull business out of the toolbox. And I find, we talk about business and there's almost a sort of, we can't get involved in that. So we understand the term charity far better than we do business. And yet business is not a bad thing if it's used correctly, I would argue. Thank you, Nick. So what did I do? I went and listened to 8 Christian social entrepreneurs and gathered their stories and why they'd done it. I then had 8 months working with one project in the Northeast, Children Alive, as they shifted from a traditional food bank, and they bought an old pizza shop and they set up a takeaway and a community store. So they shifted from that charitable to enterprising way of thinking. And I sat alongside them and listened to the tensions within that space. People getting very angry because, we're church, we give stuff away, was one of the comments that I remember one of the PCC members saying. And then I also had a couple of focus groups, and then I brought a group of people together in Sunderland from around the country to help us explore the theology and the beliefs behind all of this. And the things that I found out was that very often something within the community was a catalyst for that change, for that shifting. So it didn't often come out of a situation where people were sitting around a table going, what do we do next? Something would very often happen in the community, or somebody would come along with an idea and it would be that catalyst. And the social enterprises that developed were places of inclusion. And I built on that, actually. Now I've referred to it as places of belonging, places of reciprocity where people were sharing their gifts and skills, also paying for things. So that's a reciprocal relationship. Also spaces of tension. I talked about the lady coming in and getting very angry because we weren't giving stuff away. But how much do you charge for a bottle of milk in a low-income community? There was always those conversations, those micro conversations that could cause tension. It was a radical space, and I'm going to dig into that a bit more, that was trying to shift some of the systems around. There was also the need for collaboration. We can't do this alone. It's really difficult. So working with other Christian social entrepreneurs, people that get what you're trying to do, is really important. So those were the key findings that I came up with from my research. Next slide. One of the things I really was interested in were the beliefs and values that underpin these social enterprise. And I wanted to get a grounded theology. I'm not a theologian. I've never studied theology, which I think was quite useful in this sense, because I was just listening to the espoused theology, what people were saying, but also what they were doing. What was the operant theology within those spaces? And I came up with these 4 themes. I'm just going to pull out a little bit. Shalom, which was around social justice, belonging, empowerment, and reciprocity. And although none of these are exclusively Christian beliefs or values, I think they differ quite a bit from some of the beliefs and values that underpin our charitable work. And so it was that difference that I was interested in. Next slide, please. So belonging, I thought this was really interesting. And we often talk about inclusion, but it was something deeper than just belonging. John Swinton's done a lot of work around belonging with people with different abilities and disabilities. And he says that to be included, you just need to be present. To belong, you need to be missed. And this is the fundamental principle behind authentic Christian community. And it was that being missed that I was noticing. People were part of a community. They were involved in either volunteering or just being in the coffee shop every week. And so they were missed when they weren't there. So there was something deeper than just being an inclusive place that I found was really, really fascinating. And so a belief in belonging was a fundamental belief. Next slide. And then empowerment. I struggle with empowerment a bit because it sounds as though we can empower people that have so many systems and situations stacked against them that I don't think we really can. But as a community organizer, I think of power as the ability to act. So empowerment is just allowing people to act within these spaces, and whether that's having the ability to choose your own food, as this is Children Alive, and this is their new community store that they set up. And it was priced very carefully. There were certain products that were free, but also people chose often to buy one or two things and had that power to act. So that empowerment was a key value, and also a value that made lots of people start to explore social enterprise. Next slide, please. Reciprocity. So anybody that's been involved in asset-based community development knows that reciprocity is at the heart of that approach to community development, that we've all got gifts, skills, talents, and passions, and we can all contribute. And I really like the work of Professor John Barclay, who's done an awful lot around St. Paul and the gift. And he talks about the fact that in Greek Roman times, most people were poor, 90% of people were poor. So when we talk about gifts, it's a mutual gift, it's a reciprocity. We're not talking about a one-way sacrificial gift that we associate with charity and that we shape a lot of our Christian ministry around. So this idea that we all can contribute was really powerful in the social enterprises, and some of them, like Refuse in our next door town, you can donate for the food in the cafe. Equally, you can go and wash up, you can go and help cook. There's a reciprocity that in that space. You can bring your things that you've grown in your allotments. So they're messy spaces, but spaces of reciprocity. And I think that is an amazing Christian principle. And as I say, any of Al Barrett's work around asset-based community development also picks up on that. So yeah, it's an asset-based approach. And the final one was shalom. And that belief that the world is not as it should be. Shalom is sort of the Bible's biblical term of justice, peace, and salvation. And central to the challenge from Jeremiah 29 is that we are to remain engaged with the city and to try and attempt to transform it for the good of all. So many of the social entrepreneurs I worked with wouldn't have described themselves as being radical, but standing back, I see them as radical Christian social action in the fact that trying to shift the market, whether that is to be more inclusive of people that are excluded through their pricing or for the people they employ. They are saying that the market system excludes a lot of people, and that doesn't have to be the case. So as I see them as radical spaces. Your Riger also talks about biblical justice as an understanding of solidarity and restoring those relationships with people who are marginalized, people that benefit from the economic system as it is, as many of us do, and others are excluded. And that justice is the restoration of those relationships. And again, within all of the social enterprises, I saw spaces where these relationships were being restored. So I concluded that social enterprises are quite a prophetic ministry. It's a radical ministry which aims to shift the market system to restore relationships and with the marginalized. Thank you. I'll be taking questions about my research later, so jot them in, any questions and answers into the chat for Amy, and then we'll pick up on those. Thank you.
So we thought it might be helpful just to give you some examples of social enterprises. You'll know some of them, perhaps all of them, and one of the big ones is The Big Issue, founded by Gordon Roddick of The Body Shop and John Bird. And the Roddicks themselves, the Body Shop was conceived as a social enterprise in their way. Although it was a commercial organization, it was aiming to increase its products in an environmentally friendly way and use their profits in positive ways as well. So it could be conceived in that way. With The Big Issue, John Bird himself obviously was homeless. You'll have seen him perhaps on Question Time or heard him on the radio talking about a hand up, not a handout, and the need to think differently. And that characterizes quite a lot of social entrepreneurs. And the point about the Big Issue magazine, that they newspaper that they sell, is that homeless people are their customers and actually have to buy the magazine at half the cover price, and then they sell those magazines at full price to you and me and to others outside supermarkets and in the street. And the point about that is that it gives them respect. You're entering into an economic transaction with those sellers. It's not a charitable donation you're making. You are paying for that magazine, and your kind of moral obligation is to take it away and actually read it and see it in that economic way. You're giving them value as human beings, and they are earning their money by selling those magazines. And that's become a model that's used throughout the world. In lots of other countries, The Big Issue is now a thing. And it's not about making money for The Big Issue, except that it covers its costs and helps them deliver more support for homeless people. So, People, Planet, Profit, it's actually it's a virtuous kind of circle. One of my charities is the old Diocesan Council for Social Responsibility. There used to be loads of these. Most of them have gone now, but they were, I think, set up around after the First World War, and a lot of them did social work or became separate social work charities independent of the church. But a lot of the time, churches and dioceses were doing the work themselves. And in my case, CSR here was doing adoption and probation until the 70s and probation till the 90s. But we're now we've done various different things at different times, but we have tried to develop our community engagement work, which is all around an asset-based development program, and sold that to 5 other dioceses. We're in the process of doing some research on young people's mental health, working with somebody who was the UK clinical director of the Anna Freud Foundation. And we're looking at the possibility of providing professional training in mental health, both for young people to be mentors to one another, peer-to-peer, but for parents and grandparents and carers, and for volunteers and staff, social workers and teachers and people like that, to normalize it. But you could see how you could charge fees for those training programs, and that could potentially cover all or perhaps most of the cost of providing that training. That's what we're thinking. We run Good Neighbours. We've done that for nearly 50 years. We're finding the funding is reducing, so we're considering how that might become a membership scheme. And there's another characteristic around social enterprises of trying to find ways around the problems that you will inevitably encounter. It's not necessarily approaching them head on, but finding ways around it. In Winchester Diocese, they had a social responsibility fund they didn't know what to do with, and asked for some help. Could we help them? I said, yes, we could. And we suggested that rather than just spend it on a worker and the money being used up, that they tried to set up a social enterprise. And I suggested that social enterprise could be in early years, nurseries and preschools, because it engages the church directly with children and young families, the missing generations in our churches. It's run profitably in some areas by big companies, including organizations like Bright Horizons, which is owned by American shareholders. And if they can make a profit out of it, why can't we? And then we can plow that money back into areas where they wouldn't be so profitable or profitable at all. And that's like a cross-subsidy model, but requires sufficient scale. They're always going to be needed. The government's actually trying to expand it at the moment. There's an announcement today about the funding levels. There are still huge questions about it. 3,000 settings closed last year because it's such a difficult area. Very high barriers to entry, like Ofsted inspection and regulation. You need expertise. You have to have people who are trained at least to level 3 to count in ratio. And it hasn't been an easy thing to do. We started with 3 small preschools. We took over two other villages. They closed, and we started a preschool in those. And the big issue for us was we had to subsidize them as they were getting to scale themselves, because they weren't actually at sufficient scale to be profitable. So there needed to be a fund on which we could draw to make that happen. And then in February, in the summer of 2021, we were alerted to the possibility of a group of settings in Southampton called Paint Pots, which we eventually took over, and we now have 12 settings, 6 nurseries and 6 preschools, and we have a sustainable business at last. 75% of our settings are in areas of disadvantage, but we still managed to make a profit, which has gone down from 300k last year to 160k this year. And that's largely because of the national minimum wage requiring a 10% increase in salaries, which is great and good for people at the bottom end. But the government funding for early years, which is 2/3 of our income, only went up 4.7%. And guess what's going to happen this year with another 10% increase in the national minimum wage? We're all holding our breath to see if the government will give us that 10% increase in funding. We don't expect it, despite the announcement today. We have maintained a good relationship with the previous owners, who were Christians and working in Southampton, although the settings themselves weren't set up that way. So I have 185 staff now, and none of them were recruited originally to work in a Christian social enterprise. So we have to be very careful about how we work with that. I work closely with the diocesan education team, and we have got some support for including some basic awareness around Christian festivals, but that's about the extent of it. And they see me, I'm the executive director and the running the organization. They see me in a dog collar, and we have some interesting conversations, but we have people of all faiths and none. So you need some profitable settings to subsidize those which aren't. And it's going to take us perhaps 3 or 4 years to get to the point where we've built up our settings sufficiently that we can then do other things with the profits. But we have a turnover of £4 million, and the aim is in due course, we will have capacity to begin perhaps to look at setting up some other new settings where we might need to put a lot of money into the building, but also can begin to look in other areas and perhaps support churches in socially enterprising ways, perhaps even with grants and things like that. But it's a stressful business to run because you're always trying to struggle with recruitment and retention in early years, which is a problem nationally because of the government funding. Val.
Thanks, Nick. So I just want to pick up on, I don't know these stories as much detail because I'm not working within them, but from my research, I was really interested in the point that Nick made about asking different questions and looking for different solutions. So Clean for Good is one of my favourite examples because it brings together two things I'm passionate about. One is social enterprise, but the other one is broad-based community organising. So the community organised telco in the East End of London were asking their congregations what's putting pressure on you, and a lot of them worked in the cleaning industry in London and had numerous jobs and couldn't afford to live. And so they started the living wage campaign, which is now huge. So it started in this church setting. And then there was a meeting of the church where I think it was St Andrew's in the Wardrobe, and I'd love to have been there because we're having a conversation. Okay, the living wage stuff is happening and everything, but what do we do as a church? And somebody apparently suggested that they provided a drop-in where people could come after they'd finished work, have a cup of tea, could be supportive, that nurturing environment. And then somebody else said, but what would it look like if we set up a business to employ cleaners in London, pay them their living wage, not have any 0-hour contracts, invest in their training, think about the products we're using. We talked about planets, so they're very careful about the products that they use as well. And so they set up Clean for Good, that has now had numerous awards. It hit tricky times, obviously, during lockdown, but they managed to survive. They've just had an amazing photographic exhibition just to make staff feel valued and visible, because so often cleaners are not visible. So that's an example of an issue that came from the community, and a different question was asked to the normal one that we would very often make within our church congregations. And this and Clean for Good was a result. Next slide. The other trend that I'm seeing, and then which comes back to that empowerment question, was the shift away from food banks. And I see this so in Space 4 and in Children Alive locally. They're two of the projects that I work with. Seeing people come in and feel really embarrassed about using a food bank, and that dignity that was taken away, and not having choice about what you could take away, what your family needed, was the issue that galvanized people to go, actually, could we do something different? And so there's a shift away from certain food bank models to a pay-as-you-feel, and this is Refuse, which is a local cafe to us. And there's envelopes on the tables, and you pay as you feel. They use surplus food, which a lot of these spaces are using, which again, there's a big ethical conversation to be had around that. Should we be putting more pressure on our supermarkets to have less surplus food if we're thinking about the planet? But at the moment, there's a lot of surplus food, and they're using that in their pay-as-you-feel cafe. Food pantries as well, social supermarkets, paying one forward. There's a reciprocity within all of these spaces, and people have power, the ability to act, to make more choices, and to be part of something that they might feel excluded from. Thank you.
So we're coming towards the end now. Just want to summarise with a few slides around what might work in particular or not work. And we've mentioned some of these things as we've been talking about thinking differently and so on, finding ways round barriers which occur. There's something important with a social enterprise about intentionality, the idea of actually we're intending to make this a trading entity in some way, and that requires careful thought, and the importance of focusing on getting a few things sorted at the beginning rather than trying to be the be all and end all. And charities struggle with this. They struggle to limit what they're doing often, but actually if you're going to set up something that's going to work and be successful and survive, you need to be really focused on that particular starting point niche area. And it may be that by doing it you realize you need to switch focus or move a bit. That's fine, but being too general, trying to be all things to all people, doesn't work. And it's okay to take risks, but measure them, mitigate them, hedge against them in whatever way you can, but you're not going to get anywhere without taking a few risks. As I said at the beginning, the important thing is to learn from mistakes, never to make them. There are all sorts of models and approaches, and I often say to people, it's only a sin to plagiarize in academic environments. In these things, thou shalt steal, because it's okay. It's like love. You can multiply it. Multiply the good ideas, imitate them, copy them, and use them, and that's fine. And I'd be very happy to share anything we're doing with others for you to go and do it in your way, in your place. But it's important also to look at the context. And that's the asset-based approach, about looking at the strengths and abilities you've got in your team, in your places, in your people, and growing from those opportunities. The other thing I often talk about is the need to focus on demand rather than supply. The church is absolutely chock full of supply side solutions. We will supply more courses, more events, more activities, and surely people will want to come. We're very poor at examining demand and seeing whether there is any demand before we start something. So I've come across many churches saying, we want a cafe, so we're going to hire a shop on the high street. Actually, there are other ways to begin, like pop-ups or piloting something in the short term that don't cost a 10-year lease or something like that. You need to find ways to test out what you're doing, pilot it, prototype it, it's sometimes called, if it's an entirely new idea. But listen to demand, find out where people are itching and see what you can do to supply something they want and might pay for. The other example I've come across is Andrew Mawson of Bromley by Bow. You may have come across his book, The Social Entrepreneur, which is one big ego trip for him. But the Bromley by Bow Centre was a URC church in East London that was failing. It had 12 people over 70 in the early 80s. And he's transformed it into this major social enterprise centre that has regenerated a whole area of London. But he started with a woman who wanted to set up a dance class and hire his hall. And if he just hired the hall, it would have failed. But he said, let's work together and work this as a social enterprise and see if we can perhaps run dance classes and charge parents £1 for their kids to come. And they did that. And all the social workers, Val referred to this sort of thing earlier, complained that you can't charge poor people, but they would do anything for their children. And by making it a charge and making it enterprising in that way, it was able to sustain and carry on. And the qualities of the person doing it, because they are a professional dancer, meant that it was really highly successful in an area which would never have had somebody's professional attention at that level in the past. So, these are all opportunities. Val, you or I going to do this?
Yeah, so there are different models of change that the church is involved in, whether it be charity, whether it be advocating, or whether it be social enterprise. It won't work everywhere. So if you go away from here and go, I really want to do this, but actually it's not the right time or the right place, or you haven't got the right people, it won't work. I think differently about, it needs different thinking. So we've talked about that, different mindsets. And often, you know, I know Nick's here, but it's not often in the clergy. None of my examples were led by clergy. And also the capacity. It's a huge investment. So it might not be your local church leader that takes this on, and it might be better if it's not. It can, as we said, it can generate social value in different ways, employing people, environmental awareness, and surplus. And it's a fresh model to consider in some places. It takes a long time. When we were in Space 4, Children Alive, we set ourselves 3 to 6 months of experimenting, and we kept saying this is our experimental time, which was really gave people the opportunity to have a go at something and come back 2 weeks later and went, well, that didn't work. That's fine, you know. So you're constantly experimenting, but actually labeling it, that was really important. And the thing that I would add to this list is consider where you may be angry about issues within your community. If you're doing it, where's your passion? And I use anger intentionally because Audre Lorde says that anger's full of intelligence and action. So yeah, if people are a bit sort of so-so about things, it might not work. Where's the passion? What do you want to change in the world? What could you be really good at? And then the final question is, how do you think you could generate some income from this? So those 3 questions are really important. What are you passionate about? What could we be good at? Because there might be other people that will be better placed to do it. And how could we maybe generate income from this? Start to generate income. Thank you.
Okay, so there are some interesting websites here which you'll be sent when you're sent the presentation, and we'll send that out. We'll send that to Amy as a PDF, I expect, and she can send it round to you. There are now opportunities for comments and questions. We had a few submitted earlier on. I've talked a little bit about cafes. There was a question about the legal side. There is no single legal entity that is a social enterprise. You can operate as a social enterprise, as a charity, as a church, as a limited company, as a community interest company, as an industrial and providence society. It's just a question of what you do with your shares and sharing of the profits and the intention behind it. There are examples in every sphere of organizations that have done it that way. In general, it's cheaper and easier if you can start within the structures you've already got. But the reason to set up a separate entity, I would say, is to manage risk. So if you're taking on a contract, for instance, with contractual obligations, or if you're taking on employees, you might want to manage that in a separate entity, either a subsidiary company or a separate charity, perhaps something like that, or a community interest company. But when you do that, you have to think about governance and who is going to be there and have you got the right skills. And you need boards that are selected for skills, knowledge, and networks, not representation. On my 2 boards, I have no people there as representatives. They are all there because they contribute something. And we have very active and sometimes argumentative meetings, but they will push back, they will question and probe, and that's really what you want. You really need that, and it's healthy. Now, are there any other particular things?
We don't have any questions that have come through, but this is your chance, everyone, to ask those questions, whether technical, theological, big, small, anything, no silly questions as always. Put them in the chat, or you can unmute and ask as well, or comments. Liz has put a comment here. She knows someone who started a secondhand bookshop in their touristy area church in the centre of a city, which was very successful, but that only worked in that place because it was the right place with that footfall. Thank you, Liz.
Yeah, use the opportunities, the assets you've been given. There are churches that are right in the heart of city centres or shopping centres, and others which are further out, and their opportunities, their markets are different, really, the area in which they operate.
The story of the Grassmarket community in Edinburgh is amazing, because the local vicar just kept some old pews. And then when he started to engage with the homeless community in Edinburgh, they started to use these pews to make beautiful wooden furniture and things, and that has developed. But as he said, he bumped into social enterprise, didn't realize he was doing it, and all of a sudden he went, oh my goodness, this is what I'm doing. But had used the old pews, so he'd been very creative. Don't chuck your pews out.
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
We did some work in a place called Paulsgrove 8 years ago. We started with some community development work, and this is an area of disadvantage in Portsmouth, and they were talking about how proud they were of it, even though other people might think of it as an area they didn't want to be or to live. And I have a question I ask in every community: what will bring light, hope, and joy here? Because if you ask the needs question, it's a deficits question, and all you'll get is debt counselling or something like that. If you ask the asset question, what will bring light, hope, and joy, and love, and positivity here, you're much more likely to get a carnival or a party, but you'll never get that answer with the deficits questions. So we ended up setting up an events cooperative based on the church, because that was what they needed. And we actually got a big grant from the lottery to do that. But sadly, COVID intervened in the middle. So we did half the work and we did some of the events, but we didn't end up getting a sustainable entity out of it as we'd hoped, because obviously COVID hit hospitality and engagement programs big time. But there is a hugely positive legacy as a result of it. So it was worth trying. Didn't work at that moment, but it might work in the future.
Another comment here just saying that Emmaus is a good example of a great social enterprise, but they still need to fundraise for donations. It's hard to make enough profit.
Yeah, I would also reiterate that the majority of social enterprises that I worked with were hybrid models, so they still relied on, which again can leave you in a strong position, particularly when we hit COVID. Actually, if you had a hybrid model, you can then rely on some grant income, and not purely on your generated income. Do you want to say more about that, Nick?
Yes, I mean, I think often, my charity, CSR in Portsmouth, has some investments, so we use some of that. We have grants and contracts with local authorities, or we did, and we have a current one with health commissioners. And we're looking to generate income. It's often that virtuous kind of connection of a lot of different things, and where you can get paid for it, you do, and where you can generate income, I think it's worth doing, because the income that comes from the trading element is unrestricted, whereas the grant income, the income from contracts, that has to deliver a particular product or service and produce impacts and outcomes. The thing I do avoid, and I personally do not like, are the ones which transfer, where the government's, for instance, trying to transfer all the risk onto voluntary organisations, which they did with some of the prisons work, didn't they, in Peterborough? The entire risk was transferred, and they were only paid if they were successful. So having spent the money, if they weren't successful, they didn't get paid, and the whole thing inevitably failed. I thought that was deeply unfair.
Well, Val, did you want to ask the question or say anything about further training opportunities?
Yeah, and I've been given some funding by the William Temple Foundation, who supported my research, to do some training. But I don't want to just put something on that's not going to be relevant. So if anybody is interested in training and would like to share with me what they think would be useful, whether it be online, whether it be on person, how you think that might look, I'd be really interested to hear from you Thank you.
And I'm sure that if there's any questions that crop up after this as you're thinking things through, you do feel free to send them on to us, and I'm sure Nick and Val would be happy to answer them or have a chat with you as well. I think we are good to finish up there. So thank you so much to everyone for coming along this morning, and thank you so much to you, Val and Nick, for your time and your insights into this. We really do appreciate it. We will send everyone an email, hopefully later on this afternoon, with the recording and the resources from today. But as I said, don't hesitate to reach out with any other questions. Otherwise, yeah, thank you for coming. Have a lovely afternoon, everyone. Bye.